At the moment, we're always hearing about AI this and AI that we've entered into the age of AI, etc., etc. But believe it or not, the concept of AI music has been around for a long time, literally hundreds of years. And what's crazy is that some of these AI concepts that composers were coming up with in the 1700s have a direct relationship to AI concepts in music even today. This is Der Allerzeitfertige Menuetten- und Polonesen-Komponist by the composer Johann Kernberger from 1757, and it is the oldest known example of what we call a musical dice game. It works like this. You roll either 1 or 2 dice, and the number you roll corresponds to these columns. The rows correspond to what throw of the dice you're on. So if I'm on my first roll and I roll a 9, that will correspond to the number 123. I then have to scroll through my PDF file until I find a bar of material with the label 123. This then becomes my first bar. For my second roll, if I were to roll a 4, that gives me the number 6, which would then become bar 2. And you just keep going like this until you've exhausted all of the rows and have a nice sounding piece of music. And there's many more examples of this from around this time, the most famous of which has the very simple title Walzer oder Schleife mit 2 Würfeln zu komponieren, so viele man will, ohne etwas von der Musik oder Komposition zu verstehen. It's attributed to Mozart by his publisher, but we're not sure whether it's actually by Mozart or not, and I mean, well, who cares? Mozart gets enough attention anyway. In this dice game, the function of the rows and the columns is switched, and the music is split into 2 parts. You have an A and a B part. But other than that, it works in just the same way, and it also produces nice sounding music. Now, if you do a little bit of maths, the number of possible combinations is pretty high. 11 to the power of 16, which is almost 46 quadrillion unique pieces of music. How much is that? Well, you know that really thin Bible paper? If you printed every version of this piece onto a separate page of that thin paper, the stack of paper would reach from here past Saturn. Now, at first glance, you might think, this is practically witchcraft. How is this even possible? But what we can do is we can substitute the numbers in the tables for the musical material directly to get a better idea of what's going on. If you're creating a musical dice game like this, there are a couple of things that you have to take into consideration. First of all, you have to make sure that all of these seams work in every combination, that every bar can link up sensibly with every other bar in the next column. What also helps is if the underlying harmony is more or less the same for every bar in every column. In fact, in this particular dice game, there are even a couple of dirty little tricks. The bass parts all look very similar, and if you look at the last column, every single cell is the exact same. In the original numeric table, you'll see that there is a different number for each cell, but all of these are just duplicates. They all lead to the exact same bar of material. So if you take all of the duplicates into consideration, our stack of paper no longer reaches all the way to Saturn, but would rather only be about 79 times the distance between Earth and the Moon, which is a real shame because I would have loved to have gone to Saturn. But even though trillions of different combinations of music are still technically possible with this game, those trillions of pieces would sound very similar. Now, this might seem like a bit of a scam after I told you all of that, but the reason this game works is because if each bar were completely different, the end result would be jagged and inconsistent. It's these tight musical relationships which allow you to randomly swap out the bars. Now, hundreds of years later, with the invention of computers, suddenly we can take this methodology and add additional dimensions of complexity to it. The first person to play around with this extensively was the American composer David Cope. In the early 1980s, Cope stumbled on a brilliant idea. Why not generate music algorithmically by turning normal pieces of music into a musical dice game? And the way he did this was simple, but ingenious. genius. Cope started by taking Bach chorales and painstakingly typing them into his computer, which in the 1980s, by the way, took a very long time. He developed a program to analyze the chorales, to record and label every single beat and put it into a database. But here's the amazing part of this. The program would not only record the content of a beat, it would also make a record of where that beat was going to. In other words, its destination. And so once all of the information was stored in the database as these fragments of musical information, reassembling the pieces into a new piece of music became a relatively simple task. Let's say, for example, we pluck a beat of music out of the database. That beat is going to contain information as to a potential destination point. So all we have to do is a random search in the database for a new beat of material that aligns with the destination of the previous beat. And the assumption is that if you have 200 or 300 Bach chorales in your database, there's going to be several candidates which fit that musical relationship. By doing this, Cope found that he didn't have to give the program any harmonic rules or worry about the program making any harmonic mistakes, because nothing had been changed from the original data. It had all just been jumbled around into a new order. If the program generated a chorale that sounded like Bach, well, that's because it was technically from Bach. He then began to increase the complexity of the data that was being recorded. He began to record the beat's position within a phrase so that correct phrase lengths and cadences could be formed. Otherwise, the music would kind of just ramble on. And the results were surprisingly good. Bach chorales are relatively similar in their style and structure, but eventually Cope began to tackle more complex forms of music. He developed analytical programs that would identify things like the underlying harmony, but also the general musical function of the cell. For example, as to whether the cell was a musical statement, or was part of a musical question, or the response to a musical question. Each cell of musical data that was saved into the database became jam-packed with musical metadata. Cope also developed an algorithm to identify what he referred to as musical signatures. These were essentially motifs that were typical for a composer or a genre. By identifying and recording these musical signatures, the types of music that Cope was able to generate became quite diverse. Over the years, his programs have produced thousands upon thousands of works, not only in the style of Bach, but also in the style of Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Chopin, Schubert, Strauss, Scott Joplin, Bartok, Stravinsky, Messiaen, you name it. He's also fed his programs his own music, teaching them to compose in the style of David Cope himself. Now, there are, of course, limitations to what can be done with this methodology. You have to have enough data in the database, otherwise the program will just plagiarize from the original compositions. Also, the results will depend a lot on how well your algorithms analyze, categorize, and label data. And that might have to change from genre to genre. And so in order to build something like this properly, the programmer needs to understand music at a profoundly deep level. But perhaps the most astounding thing about David Cope's programs is the way in which they have stood the test of time. I mean, listen to this. Now, these works might not be considered masterpieces, but let's be honest, most of what people make aren't considered masterpieces either. And his programs were capable of generating entire pieces of music, all on their own in a range of different styles. Nowadays, we have neural networks and powerful GPUs, but even right now, at the time of releasing this video, we still haven't been able to come up with a program that creates music as convincing and stylistically diverse as this, all on its own. We are getting closer, but if you compare the results of Cope to some of the more modern music generative algorithms, I think you'll be surprised that we haven't made that much progress since the 1980s. And this is a testament to a couple of things. Firstly, good music is hard to generate with a computer. And secondly, well, not everything is about computational power. Sometimes nothing beats a deep, unique understanding of an artistic discipline.